So, got the still life, got our still life here, okay? And like I said before, we've got some eggs, some paper white narcissus. Uh, I put a piece of cloth down on the table to create some contrast with the surroundings. And just a moment, we'll get started here. Okay, so I'm going to begin our process by just making a couple quick marks with very light paint. And I just want to sort of feel my way through this picture and put some gestural marks down so that I can understand where my subject is going to be on the canvas. I'm not worried about a lot of accuracy right now. You can see that the shapes are very, very simple. If you see my little dog there, he's probably going to be here too often. I apologize in advance. Now you see that I'm not using thick paint. I'm watering it down so that it's almost the consistency of watercolor. This is actually paint that was left on the palette from a previous painting session. What's you got over there, buddy? What do you have? Huh? Are you getting at stuff you shouldn't be at? So, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time getting the perfect color either. Right now, I just want to get every square inch of this canvas covered with some color. Doesn't even have to be the correct color. It just has to be something other than white. Because that gives me something to start to respond to. Or not start to respond to, but something to respond to. Something to work with. Okay, so in 4 minutes, we have colors and shapes on the entire canvas. Now I'm going to start to spend a little more time to develop some of those colors and shapes, and I'm going to begin by putting some paint on the palette again. So just a moment while I get that paint ready. Okay, so I have the palette set up that I'm going to be using, and I've got my darker colors. I have some phthalo green, phthalo blue, blue, ultramarine blue, and phthalo blue, alizarin crimson, cadmium red medium, cadmium red light, cadmium yellow medium, cadmium yellow light, and a little bit of white paint. I'm going to work with some relatively thin paint to start, and I won't start to use thicker paint until I am convinced about where things need to be in the painting. And you could say, well, why don't I draw everything first? I've drawn these things in my sketchbook, so I don't feel like I need to draw them in the painting. But I'm going to work with those shapes that I'm becoming familiar with and kind of explore the shapes that I see. So in this second part, after I block it in, I'm going to continue to use the a bigger flat brush. In fact, I want to use a different brush. I'm going to use this 2-inch wide brush instead because it really covers quickly and keeps me from getting too fussy at first. And I don't want to get too wrapped up in details without knowing where everything is. So, lay in some darker color right now. Another thing I'm going to try to do is avoid outlining my objects. I know you need to have some kind of border, some kind of edge, but you don't need to outline everything. You can simply put a mark down where something begins or ends and use different marks with your paintbrush and different colors to signify those begins, those endings. So just a little stab of color here or a stab of color there. And since the paint is wet, you're going to have some drips and some runs. Don't worry about that right now. Because as your painting becomes more realized, more fully realized, you will be using thicker paint, and that will have less of a tendency to drip and run, and it will take care of itself. As you build up those final layers, the paint is going to have a little bit more body, if you will, and that body itself will keep the paint in place. Now, I like to have objects with different sorts of surfaces. This little blue bowl here has some interesting reflections in it, even though at first glance it seems to just be dark shapes. Then you start to see that the colors of the cloth are being reflected in the bowl. Okay, so now after a few more minutes, getting more of the basic shapes in place, starting to work a little more closely with the color, and trying as best I can to stay in the same perspective so that the relationships of the objects start to be developed as much as their shapes are developed. And this is important because, um, you know, you don't want to spend too much time working on only on a single place or single object, because it it doesn't work right with the other forms. You want to try, even though it's difficult, to move around the entire picture and or your entire subject and develop all those things almost simultaneously. If you find yourself working on one object for too long, you know that it's time to move. If you start to become obsessed with getting one part right, it's time to move on to a different part. That becomes very difficult, but I can't stress that enough, how important it is to move around the entire setup. I'm going to sock in a couple darker tones here. You don't have to buy a big brush either to do this. You can go to any of the big box hardware stores like Home Depot or Lowe's and get yourself some brushes. And I don't get the cheapest brushes because they're just a disappointment, but you don't have to get the most expensive brushes either. Just a nice trim brush or sash brush to paint windows. Those work great for this kind of thing. In fact, I usually have some of those in my kit because they're good bristles and they give you some good resistance. I like some resistance on my brushes. And by that I mean that it doesn't just bend over with the paint. There's a stiffness to the bristles. Now, as soon as you start adding white to the paint, yeah, it lightens it up, but not as much as you may think, because it also becomes more opaque and you're no longer seeing the color of the canvas through the paint. And you'll find that if you use a lot of white, that your paintings get kind of chalky. So you should almost treat white as if it's your most valuable color. You see that I don't like cover a whole area with one color. I'm constantly moving around. I have students, sometimes they'll sit down and for a half an hour they'll mix up one color of paint, and then they'll cover a whole section of their painting with this one big flat color of paint. And then 5 minutes later they'll say, oh, I can't mix that color anymore. Well, you don't need to mix that color anymore. You mix another color. Because this blue is not the same here as it is up in the front or in the back. It's changing, and that's why I'm not worried about it being the same. You know? Some places it's more purplish, some places it's more bluish, some places it's more grayish. It's okay. Okay, so here's a close-up of the still life itself. It's more correctly kind of a view like like this. And here's the painting so far.